The lumber I'm going to be using for this project is some premium grade Douglas fir. And the reasons I'm using this is because, one, the Home Depot by me carries a nicer grade Douglas fir than just construction grade lumber. You can see the grain is fairly straight and vertical, and just as important, there's very few knots in all of the boards I picked out. You can work around the knots to some extent, but for the most part, if you're cutting these intricate profiles on these smaller pieces of wood, the knots can really get in the way. So I only bought a stack of 4 because I'm going to be doing this project in 2 sets because there's 2 different sized panels. And that's just because even though this is a nicer grade lumber, I don't want to plane down all of my lumber and let a stack of it sit for probably a week or 2 before I get to it. So it's easier to just buy it in sets. And even though this is a nicer lumber, I did go through just about an entire pallet of wood to get these 4 boards from Home Depot. So all the measurements for this project and the profile I'm going to be detailing are all based on what the customer wants and on the style of the door I'm trying to match. So this first set of I'm going to be making 4 of one type of panel and 1 of a bigger size panel, and I'm going to show me making the bigger size panel because by then I've worked out all the errors in the construction of them. And these other panels are going to be very skinny and only 1 window, so a lot of people won't be using that sort of design. But since I have the lumber, I'm going to be showing how I'm going to plane down these pieces. So this lumber is 1.5 inches thick, and the final door is going to be 1 3/8 inches. So I'm basically just going to plane these down to 1 3/8 inches and then have a stack of lumber I can then start working with. This is what that panel I'm going to be copying looks like, and you could see the detail. You could also see on this one style how they routed a groove and put a piece in there, and I think I'm just going to cut this long and then cut a rabbet on either side to duplicate that. One rail is going to be 11 3/4, and the widest I could get this dimension at the store is 11 1/4, so that bottom rail is going to have to be pieced together. I'm going to use this bigger, longer piece of lumber I have left to cut my 2 stiles, and one of them is going to be 4 15/16 by 92 1/8, and the other one's going to be 3 5/16 by 92 1/8. Now this piece of lumber has a lot more knots than some of the other ones I picked out, but the Douglas fir and these wisps were kind of full of knots. So I'm going to do my best to avoid getting these knots towards the edges so that when I route my detail work in there, it won't hit the knots. If they're in the middle of the panel, it's not going to make that huge of a difference. So since this is still lumber from the hardware store, it has that rounded over edge. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take about 1/8 inch off of one side to get rid of that roundedness, give me a nice straight reference points, and then flip it and use that edge against my fence and rip my 2 stiles. So I mapped out where those 2 rabbets are going to go according to the dimensions on the original door. And I set up a sacrificial fence on my table saw and my dado stack so I could cut these rabbets in one pass through the saw. Now, since this door is a little older, I don't know if originally it started out the same. These 2 rabbets are different sizes by like a 1/16 of an inch. So I'm going to cut this one, adjust the saw height, and then cut the second one. Before I cut my rails, I like to route my profile on all my stiles. I just find it's easier to lay out the measurements for the rails with the stiles already have the profile on the side. So this is the bit set I purchased to make these doors. It's a 3-piece set from Eagle America, and it comes with the beading bit, which makes your profile, the matching cove bit, which will cut your cove to go over that beading bit, and it also comes with a rabbet to cut the recess on the back of the mutton for your glass. I didn't use the rabbet bit just because I found it was easier when making multiples of these, instead of always switching out the bits to just use my dado stack. So this is basically what these 3 bits are going to make for you. And this is a leftover mutton from my first project. In order to fit those other doors, I ended up cutting off this little tenon that it leaves and just wrapping it around the edge of those doors. And that's because since these are panels, not actually doors, they're going to be screwed and glued into place, and they're not going to be movable parts. So you don't have to worry about super heavy duty joinery on these. Now on those ones, I'm using really deep tenons on the rails to connect to the stiles for strength. I wouldn't rely on just these coves if you're making bigger size panels. Now if you want to make full-fledged French style doors or bigger doors, they sell these bit sets that will make it so you can cut a tenon any size you want. It's basically similar to this, but the cove bit doesn't have this bearing on top which sets the depth for you, and you could run this cove bit as far back on the piece as you want. If you're making doors or even movable parts that are going to be heavy and need to be sturdy, I would recommend going with that sort of bit set over this one with the set depth. For what I'm doing, this bit set's fine, and it's also about at least half the price of having bought the beading bit to make the larger tenon doors. Now if you want these style muntins on just plain glass windows, the same company also sells a kit that will make, without the rabbets or the tenons, almost like facade glass inserts that you can get to go in your doors. Now in order to cut all these parts, you're gonna want a router table. It doesn't have to be a fancy router table, but definitely a router table with an adjustable fence. And that's for safety, and because these parts are going to get really small and sliding them through here becomes very unsafe if you don't have a stable table, but also because if any of these dimensions are off square or not square, they're not going to line up and your door just won't work. This isn't really one of those things that you could kind of mess around and tweak with. You can if you're fine with putting a lot of putty on stuff, but in general it's just not going to work if you don't have a router table. For these bits, I have a 2.25 horsepower Bosch router set up in my stand. If you want to use the larger bit sets that will make the larger tenons, it's recommended to not use anything under 3 horsepower. And for this bit, I'm setting my RPM to 18,000. And then I can adjust my fence and start cutting all of these pieces. The other plus side to a set like this, if you can get away without having to use those longer tenons, is because you have bearings on all your bits, they're very easy to set up. I basically put the bit in there and then use the straight edge across that bearing to set my fence. Now when I did the first set of doors, I made 2 sizing blocks. This one has the exact depth and size of the rabbet as well as the profile bit in the front, and I could use that for each consecutive setup to make sure that everything's lined up the way the previous one. And I also made a sizing block for the cove cutting bit that I can use as well when it comes time to cut the cove. And that's just nice because every once in a while you're going to have to switch around these bits and you're not going to be able to cut all your pieces at once, and you want to make sure you're cutting on everything the same every time. You can see with those 2 sizing blocks, if you put them together, that joint is a perfect fit. So then once I have my fence set, I could use that sizing block to raise this bit and get it exactly how I had it for the last set of stiles. Now, even with all the tools to set up these bits, even with the sizing block to make sure it's the right way, before I cut any of my parts, when I change any of the bits out or change something on my table saw, I take some scrap and I run it through. It's so much easier to notice slight changes on a piece of scrap than running your finished stock through and realizing that there was a minor adjustment to be made. I cut a little test piece on the edge of this scrap piece of lumber and lined it up with my sizing block, and the profile matches perfectly. So now I'm going to route this profile on both of my stiles. That profile routed on the inside edge of both my stiles, I can now lay them out like I would for the actual size door and measure for my rails. Now for my table saw blade to the edge of my table is 20 inches. So this door needs to be 38 and 7/16. So if I set my fence to 18 and 7/16, I'll get that 38 and 7/16 by using the square edge of my saw and the fence to lay out this door. Now in the thicker style, I'm going to be putting a 3-inch tenon into this, and then in the thinner one, I'm going to be putting a 2-inch tenon. So after I took those marks, I can measure between my two lines, and I got 35 1/4. So my bottom rail and my top rail will be by their designated thickness, as well as 35 1/4. I took one of these leftover boards and mapped out my rails. So I'm going to rough cut both of these at 36 and then square them up on my table saw. So this one's going to end up at 35 1/4 by 5 7/8, which will give me this leftover piece right here. And this one's going to be 35 1/4 by 11 13/16. Since I couldn't get a board wide enough to get that 11 13/16, I could take this scrap and attach it with some biscuits or some splines to this board and use that as my bottom rail. So I put a 1/2-inch dado stack in there, and I'm using my tall fence since this one rail is pretty tall. And I'm just going to cut a groove about in the center of both these pieces and then join it together with a piece of MDF. Once that rail's dry and out of the clamps, I can then run both of these through my router with that profiling bit and put that edge on my rails. So with that profile on the outer edges of all of my parts, I can now cut this rabbet on the bottom of all my rails and stiles. So I put a 1/2-inch dado stack in my blade, and I'm using a sacrificial fence to get it to about 3/8 of an inch, which is what this is. And then I raised the blade to the height I needed. So I'm using my original sizing block to get those measurements right from the first doors I made. And then I just kind of slide it through and make sure that everything works. once I think I had it set up, I took a scrap piece and ran it through, and you can see that the cut is pretty much the same. So now I'm going to run all my parts through and get those identical rabbets on all of my pieces. Now, this sizing block I made basically by just running this through the profile that I'm using, but then these measurements for the thickness that will then translate to the muntins are based off of the doors that I'm using. So the rabbet is the same size as the rabbet on the doors, and this space here is also the same size as the ones on the doors I'm using. I have all my profile edging and my rabbets cut, and I wanted to show that I drew a line from where the edge of the top of this ends to where the rabbet ends. You want that to line up so that when you cut your muntins, they slide in here and slide on top at the exact same depth. If this is off with this router set, this won't work. You can see with the spares I have from the last set of panels that when you slide these on, everything lines up. So the bottom part of your muntin is going to hit the edge of that rabbet, as well as the top part of that groove is going to hit the top of your profile. So I reset this up on my table saw by using the fence and the edge of the table to set everything up, and I laid that board back on top, and you can see that it roughly lines up with those rough marks I put on either side of these boards to show where my tenons are going to be. So now I can mark where these tenons are going to be, and obviously since this one's thicker than the other, you're going to have two different sizes on each side of the board. Now I'm not actually going to do this step until I'm ready to cut my mortises, but like I said earlier in the video, I'm not relying on the cope and stick joint to glue all these together. I want tenons going into my stiles. So in order to make this joint easiest, I'm going to be ripping off this molding at the bottom section of all of my stiles, which means the tenons have to come up to the top edge, not the front edge of this molding. So with everything lined up, in order to mark that, I'm just going to use my square. And now I know that that is the depth for the tenons I want, so that when I cut this mark will line up with the edge of my stile. I could do that to all four sides of my rails and then start mocking up my tenon cutter. On either side, I wrap those marks around the tops, the sides, and the bottoms of these, just so that when you're cutting your tenons, if something doesn't line up, it would be easy to spot because you have a mark on all sides. Also, since these tenons are going to be two different sizes, I marked the smaller side with some tape on both of my rails because it's pretty easy to get these things flipped around or upside down when you're cutting. So I switched back out to my nicer blade, and I'm going to be making two cuts on each side to rough out the shoulders on these tenons. So I'm going to do the short tenons first. I'm going to cut both short ones at once so that they're both identical, and I just rose my blade to that line that I want to cut through. Then with my tenoning jig, I can take the rail off the smaller door, because they're going to be the same, to set my depth. Now the tenons on the other doors are 1/2 inch thick, which leaves about 7/8 of an inch on either side of the tenons because they're in the center of this piece. And I'm going to pretty much copy those dimensions for these. With the short side cut, I can now raise the blade to the mark for the taller side, and then without obviously moving the jig or my fence, because I want the same thickness tenons on both edges, I could run this through as well. To finish the shoulders of these tenons, I lowered my blade to cut off these flanges and then set up my fence at the depth I need it, and I'll use my miter gauge to run these through and cut off these for the small shoulders, and then move my fence over and cut them off for the big ones. These are those finished tenons, and I laid out where I'm going to be cutting the other shoulders on these. I came in an inch from either side on both pieces, and since this top part is so wide, I'm going to be cutting out 2 tenons instead of having the whole piece be one giant tenon. And for this, I'm probably just going to use a handsaw.